Rosalind, a 26-year-old woman with chestnut hair cascading down her back, stood in the kitchen, stirring a cup of tea. Her slender figure moved with natural grace, though her thoughts were far from calm. Lately, her emotions had been tangled, especially when it came to Bernard, her stepfather. Rosalind had always respected him, trusted him, but recently their relationship had taken on a different hue. It was no longer just familial. The gaze of his deep blue eyes, the warmth in his voice, everything seemed changed. Bernard, a man in his early 40s, was tall with an athletic build. His silver hair added to his charm, but the way he carried himself, confidently, calmly, protectively, had always attracted Rosalind. For years, he had been her support, someone she could rely on since he married her mother when Rosalind was younger. But lately, when he looked at her, his gaze seemed to hold something more, unspoken, as if he too was trying to make sense of this new tension between them. As the soft patter of rain outside broke the silence, Rosalind was lost in her thoughts. Bernard entered the kitchen, his presence filling the room as it always did. "Can't sleep?" he asked in a soft, soothing voice, coming closer. Rosalind's heart skipped a beat as she looked up and met his blue eyes. "Can't sleep," she admitted softly, her fingers tightening around the cup. "Just thinking." Bernard leaned against the counter next to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Something on your mind you want to talk about?" His tone was gentle, but there was curiosity in it. Rosalind hesitated, biting her lower lip. Could she say it? Could she confess what had been swirling in her head for the past few weeks? She looked down at her tea, her heart beating faster. "I don't know if I can." He reached out and placed a warm hand on her shoulder. "Rosalind, you know you can tell me anything," he said softly. "I'm always here for you." She looked at him again, feeling the heat rise in her chest. He had always been the one she turned to for comfort, advice, and support, but now her feelings were different. There was a tension between them that they hadn't acknowledged until now. "I've just been thinking a lot lately about us," Rosalind finally whispered, her voice trembling. The words hung in the air, and Bernard's expression changed. "About us?" he repeated, furrowing his brows, studying her. He too had noticed the changes between them, moments of silence that spoke louder than words, touches that lingered longer than usual, but he had always pushed it aside, knowing their relationship was bound by family. "Bernard," Rosalind began, her voice softer, filled with uncertainty. "I don't know how to explain it, but something feels different." Bernard's hand slid from her shoulder down her arm, his touch lingering longer than usual. His heart was beating as fast as hers, understanding that they were on the brink of something that couldn't be undone. "Rosalind, I felt it too," he confessed in a quiet voice, full of both care and desire. He gently tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, the simple movement sending a shiver down her spine, her pulse quickening at his words. "What does this mean? What do we do?" she asked, holding her breath, looking into his eyes. For a moment, Bernard said nothing. Instead, he moved closer, his hand touching her cheek, a gentle and tender touch that was both soothing and electrifying. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice filled with emotions. "But I can't pretend anymore." Rosalind's heart pounded in her chest as she leaned into his touch. There had been so many moments when they had almost crossed that line, when their connection seemed like something more, and now, standing here together, it was undeniable. "I don't want to pretend either," Rosalind whispered in response, her voice trembling with fear and desire. Bernard leaned in, his lips brushing hers in the softest and most cautious kiss. It was slow, as if they both were afraid of what it might mean. But in the moment their lips touched, everything else faded away. The kiss deepened, a flood of emotions overwhelming them both as years of tension dissolved in a single moment of connection. Rosalind's hands found his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart under her fingers. She could feel his restraint, how he was holding back, but she didn't want him to, not anymore. Her lips parted, inviting him, and Bernard responded, his kiss becoming more intense, more urgent. His hands slid down her sides, pulling her closer until there was no space between them. Felt right, as if this was what they both had been waiting for all this time. The soft rain continued outside, but inside, the world seemed to have stopped. There were only Rosalind and Bernard, finally allowing themselves to feel what had been building between them for so long. The kiss between Rosalind and Bernard lingered, filled with a quiet passion that neither of them had expected. The tension that had been simmering between them for weeks now burst forth, yet still held back, as if both were afraid to fully let go. Rosalind's fingers lightly traced Bernard's chest, feeling the warmth of his body under her touch, while his hand rested on her waist, holding her close but not too tightly. They slowly broke the kiss, their lips hovering a few inches apart, both breathing heavily, trying to comprehend the emotions surging within them. "Rosalind," Bernard whispered, his voice rough with emotions, his forehead gently touching hers, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. His fingers softly traced her cheek, outlining the curve of her face, as if memorizing every detail. "I don't want to hurt you." Rosalind's heart filled at his words, despite the desire between them. Bernard's protective nature always shone through, and it only made her want him more. She looked up to meet his eyes, her dark eyes filled with the same passion he was trying to suppress. "You're not hurting me," she whispered back, her voice gentle but certain. "I want this. I want you." Her words sent a surge of warmth through him, and he leaned in again, capturing her lips in another kiss, this time deeper and more certain. His hands slid from her waist to the small of her back, pulling her closer as their bodies pressed together. Rosalind sighed softly against his mouth, her hands sliding up his chest to his shoulders, feeling the strength beneath his shirt. The outside world seemed to disappear, the soft patter of rain against the windows the only sound besides their quiet breaths. Everything in this moment felt surreal, like a dream they both had longed for but never dared to believe could come true. As they kissed, Bernard's fingers slid under the hem of her shirt, touching the bare skin at the base of her spine, the sensation sending a shiver through Rosalind's body, and she instinctively pressed closer to him, her body responding to his touch with a hunger she hadn't realized. She allowed her hand to slide to his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair as she pulled him closer, deepening the kiss. Bernard groaned softly, his grip on her tightening as his self-control began to waver. He had always been strong, a protector, but tonight, being so close to Rosalind, feeling her soft curves against him, he was testing his limits. He broke the kiss again, breathing heavily, looking into her eyes. "Rosalind," he whispered again, his voice strained but full of emotions. "We need to be careful." Rosalind nodded, but the heat in her eyes told him she wasn't ready to stop. "I know," she replied softly, her voice laced with desire. "But I need this. I need you." Her words pierced him, and Bernard could no longer hold back. He kissed her again, this time more urgently, his hands roaming her back, feeling the warmth of her skin under his fingers. Rosalind melted into him, her hands exploring his body as they kissed, her mind lost in the intensity of the moment. The soft light in the room cast shadows around them, making the world intimate, wrapped in this shared moment of passion. Bernard's hands moved to her hips, lifting her slightly, so she sat on the edge of the counter, bringing her closer to him. Rosalind gasped at the sudden movement, but quickly wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him in for a kiss. Their kisses were slow but filled with longing, each one leaving them wanting more, but neither wanting to rush. Bernard's lips moved from her mouth to her jaw, leaving soft, lingering kisses on her skin, while his hands held her tightly. Rosalind's head tilted back, her eyes closed as she surrendered to the warmth of his touch, her fingers tracing the outline of his shoulders, exploring the strong muscles under his shirt, while his lips found a sensitive spot on her neck. A soft moan escaped her lips as he kissed her there, the sound sending a shiver down Bernard's spine. He had always tried to keep his distance, to stay in control, but being so close to Rosalind, hearing her soft sigh of pleasure, was breaking him. He became more assertive, his hands sliding down her hips, pulling her even closer. His lips found her neck, leaving more intense kisses that made Rosalind shiver with desire. She could feel his grip tightening, as if he was afraid to let her go. His lips moved to her ear, and he whispered, "You have no idea how long I've been waiting for this moment." Rosalind opened her eyes, meeting his blue eyes filled with passion and desire. She could see his self-control beginning to waver, and it only intensified her own desire. Bernard leaned in again, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was more demanding and insistent. His hands slid down her back, pulling her even closer until there was no space between them. Rosalind could feel his heartbeat, matching her own, a steady rhythm that echoed in the unspoken connection they had created. Slowly, they pulled apart, their foreheads touching, their breaths mingling in the soft light of the kitchen. "Rosalind," Bernard murmured, his voice filled with emotions. "I never want to lose this." The sincerity in his gaze made her heart swell, and she leaned into him, her arms wrapping around his neck. "I don't want to either," she whispered back, feeling a surge of warmth that surpassed any fear in that moment. They both knew they had crossed a threshold, stepping into a new world full of possibilities. Their fingers intertwined as they shared another soft kiss, this one filled with the promise, hope, and sweet surrender of all the moments yet to come. As they stood together, embracing, the rain continued to fall outside, creating a soothing backdrop for their newly discovered intimacy. In each other, they found a connection that went beyond the ordinary, a love that was tender, passionate, and undeniably theirs. Alex gently ran his fingers down her cheek, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was light as a feather, but it sent a shiver through Rosalind's entire body. She closed her eyes, savoring the moment, feeling his hands slowly slide down her back, leaving a trail of warmth and tenderness. Her fingers tangled in his hair, gently massaging the back of his neck as she pulled him closer for another kiss. The soft light from the lamp above the counter cast shadows on their faces, creating a play of light and shadow that made the moment even more intimate. Bernard slowly traced his lips down her neck, leaving soft kisses that made her heart beat faster. Rosalind sighed softly, her hands sliding down his shoulders, feeling the strength and protection he had always given her. They moved slowly, their bodies pressing against each other. As if each movement was part of a dance they danced only for themselves. Bernard's hands slid down her hips, pulling her closer as their lips met in a kiss that was filled with both passion and tenderness. Rosalind could feel his heart beating in sync with hers, as if they were one. The soft rain continued to tap against the windows, creating a soothing rhythm that seemed to underscore their new closeness. Bernard and Rosalind stood embracing, their breaths mingling, creating an intimate space where time seemed to slow down. Bernard's hands gently slid down her back, feeling every curve of her body, as if memorizing it forever. Rosalind pressed against him, feeling the warmth of his body, his strength and protection. Their lips met in another kiss, this one both tender and filled with passion. The kiss deepened, their breaths quickening as they allowed themselves to fully surrender to the moment. Rosalind's hands slid down his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart under her fingers. She could feel his restraint, how he was holding back, but she didn't want him to, not anymore. Bernard slowly pulled away, his eyes searching hers, filled with trust and desire. "Rosalind, are you sure?" he whispered, his voice filled with care and tenderness. She nodded, her eyes shining with emotions. "Yes, I'm sure," she whispered back, her fingers gently touching his cheek. He leaned in again, his lips finding hers in a kiss filled with promise and passion. Bernard's hands slid down her hips, lifting her slightly, so she sat on the edge of the counter, bringing her closer to him. Rosalind gasped at the sudden movement, but quickly wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him in for a kiss. Their kisses were slow but filled with longing, each one leaving them wanting more, but neither wanting to rush.